We've created this process of unpacking and repacking the standards as a way for educators to understand the academic, language, and behavioral demands of the standards. It's the process of, not the product of, unpacking the standards that allows educators to not only understand the standard itself, but also to understand the implications for instruction and assessment. We begin this process by identifying the standard to unpack and repack. Here we have English Language Arts Reading Literature Standard 1 for Grade 8, where students are to cite the textual evidence that most strongly supports an analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from it. Next, we need to review the related standards. In this step, what we're doing is we're comparing our 8th grade standard against what the students are going to learn in 7th grade and what they will learn in grades 9 and 10. After we do that, we take a look at what is the content demand of the standard, or in other words, what is it that students need to know. So in this standard, students need to know textual evidence, they need to know analysis, they need to know what it means for a text to be explicit, as well as what inferences are. Next, we take a look at the standard for the cognitive demand. This is what the students need to be able to do. So here, students need to be able to cite, support, analyze, and infer. Next, we evaluate the standard for its rigor. We do this by taking a look at the content and cognitive demands together. Using Kieran Hess's cognitive rigor rubric, we can see that that standard has a DOK, or depth of knowledge, of 3. What we have here is Norm Webb's depth of knowledge, and we have Bloom's taxonomy of thinking here along this. And when students are analyzing the text and using strategic thinking and reasoning, it falls into this idea of DOK 3. Next, we want to evaluate the standard for the language demand. Common Core State Standards has 3 tiers of words. Tier 1 are our conversational words, words that we use in everyday conversation but might have multiple meanings. Tier 2, which are our general academic words, these are words that students will encounter in multiple classes. And our Tier 3 words, which are our discipline-specific words, and these are words that kids are going to find specifically in coursework, specific coursework. So when we annotate this standard for the language demand, what we're seeing is that the words cite, textual evidence, analysis, inferences, that these are general academic words that students will encounter in multiple classes. So it's important that we're using them when we write our learning targets, that when we use our teacher talk, as well as on our assessments. So these terms and the meaning of the terms transfer from class to class. You'll also see that we have conversational words that might need further description in our instruction. For example, the word strongly. Students might think of physical strength when they see that word and may not understand that strongly can also mean the best support. So it's important that when we're unpacking and repacking the standards, that when we unpack for the language demand, that we're identifying places where students might get hung up in their learning. The next step in unpacking and repacking the standards is to evaluate the standard for the behavioral demands. So far, we've talked a lot about the academics, the content, cognitive, rigor, and language demands of the standards. And this is what gets kids prepared for college and career. But we also want to get kids ready for college and career. And we do this by focusing in on the behaviors, or the behavioral demands. We've identified the behavioral demands as both the intrapersonal skills and the interpersonal skills. When we talk about intrapersonal skills, we're talking about students' ability to self-manage, which includes their ability to regulate their own behavior and emotions in order to reach goals. So some things that we might see are students taking initiative, being flexible in their work, and persevering when things get tough. We also see the interpersonal skills, which involve students expressing information to others, as well as interpreting others' message and responding accordingly. So what we might see are students being able to resolve conflicts, to work cooperatively, to be able to be trustworthy. These are those interpersonal competencies necessary to get our students ready for college and career. So when we look at this standard, we need to be able to identify what are the behaviors that students need to be successful for the academic aspect of the standard. So in order for students to be able to cite textual evidence of a text, they first have to have that intellectual curiosity and take initiative to read the text. As they're reading, they might need to self-monitor and persevere through difficult portions of the text. They need to demonstrate a work ethic and conscientiousness in order to complete their task. So these are the behaviors that students need in order to be able to cite textual evidence. When we're seeing that kids are struggling in our classes, it's important to know that they might be getting hung up on the content, cognitive, language, or behavioral demands of the standards. And when educators have that pedagogical automaticity, they're able to analyze the standards and be able to prepare for that in their instruction. So now that we know the academic, language, and behavioral demands of the standards, what are the implications for instruction and assessment? Well, this first step in repacking the standards is to identify those key terms that we need to carry through in writing our learning targets, into our instruction, as well as into our assessments to ensure that all students have access to grade level standards. So when we take a look at the standards, cite, textual evidence, supports, analysis, text, explicitly, and inference are all terms that we want to carry through, not only in our learning targets, but in our teacher talk, as well as on our assessments. The next step in the repacking process is to map the content standard to the standards for mathematical practices. The standards for mathematical practice are really those characteristics that we want of all of our students. For example, we want all students to be able to make sense of problems and persevere in solving them, to be able to reason abstractly and quantitatively, to construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others, to be able to model with mathematics, as well as other disciplines, to use appropriate tools strategically, attend to precision, look for and make use of structure, as well as look for and express regularity in repeated reasonings. So when we look at our standard for English language arts, there are 4 mathematical practices that map very well with this. For example, we want students to be able to make sense of problems and persevere in solving them, to reason abstractly and quantitatively, to construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others, as well as to look for and make use of structure. The next step in unpacking and repacking the standards is to identify the standards for literacy in all subjects. Now, since this is an ELA standard, we would skip over this step in the process, but this would be applicable to all other standards. And the last step in the process here is to actually determine your learning targets, the implications for instruction and assessment, considering the content, cognitive, and language demands, the behavioral demands, the standards for mathematical practice, and the standards for literacy in all subject areas. So for this standard, what possible learning targets would be is students will set goals for reading a text, understand what a text says explicitly, draw inferences from a text, and cite textual evidence to support analysis.